Okay, thank you very much. Thank you everyone for tuning in. There was going to be a series of book launches for the new book, Can't Pay, Won't Pay, but obviously they were all cancelled, as is only correct because of the COVID-19 pandemic. So it's moving online. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of give you a history of the poll tax, what it was, why the Tories thought it was a good idea, what the opposition to it was, some of the resistance, and then some of the lessons for today. So hopefully that will produce a lot of things that we can kind of debate and talk about afterwards. So I'm just going to start off with the poll tax wasn't actually called the poll tax officially. It was called the community charge, and it's all kind of based in the murky world of local government finance, which lots of people find quite boring and tedious, but I find fascinating because I find local government fascinating because I'm a bit of a geek like that. But the poll tax community charge policy, we have to really understand it as the culmination of the whole Thatcherite project in the 1980s. Thatcher hated really two key institutions of the left, the trade unions and local government. And she made it her mission from 10 Downing Street to try and undermine and destroy any kind of strength and autonomy that these institutions had. People will be familiar with obviously the attacks on the miners and the print workers at Wapping and so on. The local government fight back though is very interesting. It's not really talked about as much, but it was a big part of the 1980s. Obviously, the Conservatives had very bad memories of the Clay Cross resistance in the early 70s to rent increases. The actions of the militant-run Liverpool Council in '82, where they set an unbalanced budget to try and get concession, try and get money from Westminster, successfully so. And there was a big struggle around what was called rate capping in the mid-1980s. So councils like Lambeth and Liverpool and Sheffield and so on tried to have a united front campaign to try and again force concessions from central government. And a lot of the Labour councils at the time were run by people who considered themselves quite radical left, kind of municipal socialists, people like Ted Knight or Derek Hatton or Ken Livingstone in the 1980s. So there was this kind of sense of opposition there. And by the time Thatcher wins her third general election in 1987, local government's really been hammered very hard. They've had a lot of their powers taken away. There's been right to buy has been introduced. Lots of the housing is gone. Big organisations like the Greater London Council and the ILEA, which used to run all the schools in London, have been completely dismantled because they were bases for the left. So for the Conservative Party, the poll tax was going to be the final nail in the coffin. It was going to be the way of absolutely destroying any kind of Labour left organisations at all, and maybe even destroying Labour councils in Britain. So before I talk about what the poll tax actually was, it was replacing something, I mentioned it before, the rates system. Some people who are older will remember the rates, but the rates was a really old, it was first kind of introduced in 1601. So it was a very old way of managing local government finance. And essentially, you would pay money based on the nominal rental value of your house. And there was meant to be re-evaluations every 5 years, because obviously the value of property generally goes up. But the Conservatives thought that the rate system was unfair, and they'd been planning on scrapping it since the 1970s. The reason why they thought the rate system was unfair was because a family, say of 4 people living in a 3-bedroom house would be paying money just based on the nominal rental of the house, and say 2 adult partners who are working could share that cost out, whereas a pensioner living next door, also in a 3-bedroom house, who might be a Tory voting pensioner, also had to pay the same value, even though there was only one person in that house. So they thought the rate system was generally unfair. And there was another thing they didn't like about the rates, which was that if you were on benefits or you were very poor, you didn't have to pay anything. So the Tories also coming from the perspective that, hold on, this isn't fair because you've got a load of people who aren't paying, you've got people who can share the cost between families, but then other people are being penalised for it. Then there was a rating re-evaluation in 1986, which ended absolutely disastrously, and because the value of some of the properties had gone up quite considerably since the last ratings re-evaluation, and a load of middle-class Tory voters ended up getting hit with huge rate increases. this caused massive problems for the Conservative Party in Scotland and really helped contribute to what was almost a wipeout in 1987. Not quite. There was a handful of Tory MPs left, but there was just mainly Labour MPs were returned. So around this time in the mid-80s, Thatcher's beginning to kind of think about the rates and thinking, well, is there a way that we can have a fairer system? And people in the political circus around Thatcher began to talk about the idea of the community charge. And the way the community charge would work is that everyone would pay the same. Not nationally, different councils and kind of regional local government would be able to set their own community charge, but essentially everyone under that particular council or metropolitan district, for instance, would pay the same amount of money. And this was deemed to be much fairer. This is a much fairer system. And also people who are on benefits would have to pay as well. And this was really for two reasons. One, the Conservatives believed that there was a real problem in some areas where poorer Labour voters who didn't have to pay much in rates, maybe because they lived in housing which was, the nominal rental value was quite low, or they were on benefits, would vote for high-spending Labour councils. So you would have so from the Conservative point of view, you had this really bad dynamic where a load of poor people would vote for Labour councillors who would whack up the rates, which would impact on middle-class Tory voters. So the Conservatives said this was unfair. We can't have a system where the people that are most benefiting from council services, poorer people generally do access council services much more than middle-class people. But you can't have poorer people basically holding a gun to the head of middle-class people and keep on returning really high-spending Labour councils. And this was all bound up in the 80s with this whole argument that local government was profligate, Labour councils were wasting money on lesbian self-defence squads and, banning people from singing Bar Bar Black Sheep in primary schools. So there was this whole argument around local government was run by the loony left, it was spending too much money and so on. So the idea of the poll tax was that in the same way that right to buy was changing people's consciousness about maybe who they might vote for, or kind of what class they consider themselves. The idea was that the poll tax would encourage people to vote for low-spending Tory councils. So if you're faced with a poll tax bill, which is quite high, you'll think, well, I blame my local councillors. It's the Labour Party. They're spending too much money. So what we're going to do is vote for Tory councillors instead, and then my poll tax bill will go down. So it was designed to kind of encourage, to do behaviour modification for people in order to return Tory councils. So that was like a big, kind of push. And then obviously if the Labour councils didn't reduce the money they were spending, then they would be punished at the ballot box. So that was the idea in principle. The idea of the poll tax was first raised in 1982. So there was a series of government civil service kind of reviews into local government finance. And in 1982, the civil service first kind of put the idea of a poll tax into a paper, but only to kind of knock it and say that it wouldn't work. There was one civil servant who famously said, try collecting that in Brixton. And by that, he was referring to the Brixton riots that just happened in 81. And there was this kind of view in the political establishment that there were some parts of the country where the urban environment was quite lawless. And so, the idea of trying to get everyone to pay hugely expensive poll tax was just not going to work. But between 82 and 85, 86, obviously you've got the defeat of the miners. Thatcher's in the run-up to winning her third general election victory. So there's this real sense of hubris. There's this real sense from Thatcher that actually they can push ahead with it. There was one very serious mistake they made at the beginning, though. They were considering the poll tax and how to make it work. And the original proposal was something called dual running. So the dual running would be people would still pay the old rates, but they would incrementally pay more poll tax every year. So maybe 10% of your bill to the local council would be poll tax, and the other 90% would still be the old rating system. And the idea was to introduce this initially in Scotland. And the reason why they wanted to introduce it in Scotland was because, the rates of evaluation that had just happened, and the Scottish Tories were very annoyed with Westminster about that. So they were trying to throw the Scottish Conservatives a bone by introducing it there. The idea was that, so you'd introduce it in 1989, and then slowly every year up until 1999, you would increase the amount of poll tax that was being spent until eventually your entire local government bill would be poll tax. So that was the original proposal, this kind of dual running thing. But because of the severity of the Scottish wipeout in the 87 election, there was a lot of grief coming from north of the border, and Margaret Thatcher and Nicholas Ridley, who at the time was one of her allies in the cabinet and who was responsible for the poll tax, decided, actually, let's scrap the dual running thing. Let's just introduce it all in one go, one big bang. Let's, kind of pull the plaster off and just get it over and done with. And that was really the first very serious mistake that they made, because they underestimated just how significant the community fight back would be. So what were the arguments against the poll tax? There was two kind of really key arguments that coming from the left. One was an ethical argument. Essentially, you can tax property, you can tax possessions, you can tax wealth, but you can't really tax people. That's like a tax on existence, sort of it doesn't matter who you are or what you do or how much wealth you have or what you do in your life, but just the idea that you exist as a human being, you're going to have to start paying money for your right to exist. So that was one of the key arguments. But obviously, a lot of people on the left were also putting forward class arguments around it. There was the famous point that a Conservative MP said, not really realising just how bad it would sound. He said, it would only be right for someone who was like a duke in the castle to pay as much as a bin man who lived on a council estate. Those are the kind of language that the Tories used. For the Conservatives, that was fair. It's fair that people should pay the same amount. One's a human and others a human. You should just pay the same amount of money. But of course, the left, with a class understanding of it, or a pro-working class position, said that this isn't fair at all. And it's clearly going to be a whole section of people who just won't be able to afford the new poll tax. People who didn't used to pay very much at all will now have huge bills. And this is coming on the back, of course, the 1980s. There's been massive structural unemployment. Whole industries have been closed down. Wages have been suppressed for a whole section of the working class. And now at the end of all of that, they're being hit with a massive local tax bill. So there was a very sort of strong class argument there that some of the left were putting forward. It's also very important just to say very quickly that the community charge, the Conservatives said it wasn't a tax, okay? They didn't call it a poll tax initially. They called it the community charge. And the idea was that this wasn't a tax, it was a charge for using local services. So you can already begin to see like the neoliberal implication here of the difference between taxation, more generally, in terms of government spending, and a charge that you pay to use a service. So already the psychological implication there is that you're using maybe a corporation service, or maybe you're paying for Netflix, or sort of like there's a difference between a service and how you conceive that, and how your relationship is to that service as a service user, and someone who's a local citizen resident who pays tax towards an accountable local authority or regional or national government, and then that tax is spent. So I think that was a very important kind of insight into the way that the government thought about it. So the resistance to the poll tax. I'm going to start off with the Labour Party. The Labour Party's response to the poll tax was, it was atrocious. This is one of the things that I look at in the book. The Labour Party's initial response to the poll tax, when it was first kind of mooted as an idea, was that it was they were opposed to it in principle, and they would vote against it in Parliament, and all these kind of things. But once it became law, they would just have to implement it. And this is a very important part of the ideology of the Kinnock-era Labour Party, which the Labour right still really hold on to, which is that you can either be a party of protest or you can be a party of power. And so the whole Labour Party's perspective at the time was that we don't want to waste our time. It's actually dangerous to be engaging in protests and resistance and trying to stop bad laws that were being enacted. What we need to do is be a responsible party of government, so that we can go hopefully win the next election. So the NEC, Labour Party NEC, and most of the MPs, they had kind of rhetorical opposition at the beginning, so did the TUC. But as soon as the poll tax was actually implemented, they urged people to pay it. What they said is that local councils, many of whom, of course, were run by the Labour Party, so they had an actual responsibility for collecting the tax and penalising people that were refusing to do so. The Labour Party's position on that was that they wouldn't be involved in any kind of protests or anything like that. There was kind of token opposition at the beginning. So there was this campaign launched in Scotland called the Stop It campaign, which is mainly a petition. And like you can tell from the name, again, the idea was just stop it before it became a law. But as soon as the poll tax was actually voted on in Parliament, and then the local councils began to think about implementing it, the Stop It campaign stopped effectively. What you then had was the beginning of kind of resistance from below. So local people who knew they were going to be impacted by the poll tax, many of whom were active in political organisations, the left and so on, began to organise on a very local level. I mean, there'd be anti-poll tax unions almost street by street in some areas. And they began to organise, put up posters, hand out leaflets and call meetings to put forward the idea of a strategy to try and stop the tax from happening. And this was a very important development because it was very grassroots. It was completely out of the control of the trade union leadership, who were also supporting the introduction of the tax, largely speaking, and also the Labour Party. So people were involved in these, campaigns. Some of them, were run by organisations like Militant Tendency. Others were run by anarchists. Some of them were kind of quite plural and, run by kind of like a coalition of different organisations. So we're beginning to see ideologically how these different things kind of emerge. I also just want to say just very quickly at this point, because I think it's something that had a huge bearing on what happened afterwards. This is also the time when we begin to see the Scottish National Party cast off its tartan Tory sort of criticisms that people had of it, and begin to look more like a left-wing party. So there's a famous by-election in Gowan in the late 80s, where the Labour Party candidate, this is in a safe Labour seat, is absolutely trounced by the SNP, because the Labour Party's official position, and this election campaign was run by Peter Mandelson, by the way, was, we're against the poll tax now, but once it's law, and, you're going to have to pay it. That's life. Vote Labour at the next election, and then we'll get rid of it. The SNP was pushing for a non-payment strategy at the time, so they were actually going out there, not as radical as some of the socialist organisations, but they were, their kind of spokespeople and MPs and so on, and councillors were putting forward, an actual active opposition to the tax. And that was really the beginning of the shift for the SNP's electoral fortunes, where they begin to look like a credible left opposition to the Labour Party. So this brings us up to the point about kind of the debates on strategy, which I think is one of the most interesting parts in the book. The whole book is interesting, by the way, but obviously there's some bits which are better than others. The debate on strategy, I think, is quite interesting. There's really three that were put forward at the time. One was don't register for the poll tax. So there was a mass registration campaign. This was the first thing really that was done nationally in Britain, where there was a push to get everything on a national computer database. So there was a huge kind of computerization effort to try and get everyone's details on a database. If you're taxing every single person in the country, you've got to have databases to actually manage all of these things. So the initial kind of push was just don't fill out your registration forms, or fill them in late, or send them back kind of with loads of questions, or fill them in with the wrong information or something like that. So that was quite a good strategy for delaying things, and lots of councils reported that, they had very bad reporting rates. I mean, some of the councils in London, there was maybe 70% of people were sending the forms back, but then when they looked through them, they found loads of them, written by Mickey Mouse, and then loads of other people just never bothered filling in the forms or sending them back at all. So there was a huge effort there to try and gather that information, which led to a real policy of like snoopers on estates, so the councils would have hotlines you could call where you could say, oh, I know so-and-so lives at this address, they've just moved in, and then the council could send officers down to like investigate and try and get people's information on the doorsteps. There was a real, actually kind of links to the stuff around COVID-19 that's being talked about now in terms of the government trying to get people to snoop on each other because they're, going out and buying non-essential items. The problem with the don't register strategy is that the way the poll tax was set up is that there was a danger that if you were completely unknown to the local council, then for instance, you'd lose your right to vote. You could effectively become like a non-person. You wouldn't be able to use any of the local services, because if you went to the library and signed up with the local library, the council got your information and they might pass that over to the poll tax department of the council, and then you'd be on the database. So there was a real danger there that although refusing to fill out the registration form made sense to a degree, it also had kind of quite serious consequences. A lot of the left were also pushing a don't collect strategy. So this is particularly common for some of the Trotskyist organisations, who were saying that, what we need to do is we need to get the local workers, so the council workforce in unions like NALGO and NUPE, the postal workers in the UCW and so on to refuse to engage in the poll tax. So the NALGO workers should refuse to operate the computers, the NUPE workers should refuse to organise the work streams, the UCW trade union members should refuse to deliver the post. And so really the argument to try and get the working class as a class to try and resist the poll tax was a very strong and important part of those debates around strategy. The problem that argument had was that well, this will probably be a big part of the discussion afterwards, but the organised working class just wasn't really, well, they just didn't do it, essentially. There was obviously big arguments at trade union conferences, and some trade union conferences passed relatively good motions. So NALGO, for instance, which is a very big local government union, which is now part of Unison, passed a motion which was written by socialist activists against the poll tax, which was pretty good. It did kind of say that there would be a non-collection campaign, but there was a caveat in it. It was when the NEC would think this was appropriate. And of course, the NEC of the NALGO never thought it was appropriate. So again, you could get some policy passed at conferences, but the rank and file members who wanted to oppose the poll tax practically in the workplace didn't have the capacity to be able to do those things. There were some strikes and some working class action around the poll tax, but a lot of them were done around terms and conditions or kind of wages or kind of things that activists felt they could try and use to try and get a few days of strike action here and there. But no one actually really managed to organise any sustained or serious strike action or refusal to do the work of the poll tax more generally. So that was a big concern. The final strategy, which is the one that kind of won out in the end, was the don't pay strategy. So kind of beautiful in its simplicity. The idea was, just don't pay your poll tax. Just refuse to pay it. If enough people don't pay it, they can't lock us all up. So that was kind of like a big push. Militant Tendency were really involved in kind of pushing for that in particular. So that was where the kind of the can't pay, won't pay coalition came from. So there were some people that couldn't pay. They literally couldn't afford these poll tax bills. I mean, some of them were astronomically high. Some of the Conservatives believed that the bills would actually be lower, that the poll tax formula somehow would work out and it would only cost as much as the rates, maybe a little bit more. But in effect, actually, the poll tax bills were absolutely huge, particularly in some of the Labour councils in places like London and Glasgow and places like that. So some people just couldn't afford it, even with all the rebates that you could get. And then there was the won't pay. So those were people that could afford it, but they were opposed to it on principle. That it was a part of a wider movement of solidarity and resistance to an iniquitous government tax, which was deeply regressive and attacking some of the most vulnerable people in society. And this was a coalition that came together between the can't pays and the won't pays. So that was sort of the strategy that kind of won out in the end, although the other strategies were important at different parts in the struggle. But the idea was a mass non-payment campaign. And the organisation that emerged to lead this was the All Britain Anti-Poll Tax Federation. There was other federations and groups as well. They weren't quite as well organised on a national level, largely because the All Britain Anti-Poll Tax Federation had the benefit of Militant were running it at the time, and they had thousands of members kind of in the Labour Party and outside as well, and they had key figures like Tommy Sheridan, who was like a very enigmatic sort of charismatic, maybe enigmatic as well, leader of the movement up in Scotland. So I'm just going to kind of go through these other last bits of resistance before I kind of conclude on some of the big political points. So big protests outside council chambers, very important. Some of them were riots, huge fights with the police. In places like Norwich, the campaigners burst into the town hall, got into the computer room where the poll tax was being organised and smashed everything up. In Nottingham, people dressed as Robin Hood and invaded the council chamber and kind of threw foam pies around the place, although two of them actually got arrested and charged with common assault because one of the Labour councillors complained to the police about it. So there's lots of very creative, some quite radical, violent protests outside council chambers as the poll tax rate was being set. But the main battles of the poll tax movement were against bailiffs and in the courts. So when you were sent your poll tax bill and you refused to pay it, you had kind of 3 months or so. And then after 3 months, you could be taken to court. And then a judge would decide, this person needs to pay their poll tax bill. So at that point, the council could employ bailiffs to go down and what was called Point Your Goods up in Scotland. So it was, they would kind of look through your window and they could see, oh, he's got this, she's got a TV, that desk looks like it's worth £20 or something like that. And they could begin to value your goods. In Scotland, the sheriffs, so in England and Wales it's bailiffs, in Scotland it's sheriffs. In Scotland, the sheriffs actually had the power to go into your house if you weren't there. So it was a big part of the anti-poll tax movement up there was as soon as someone found out that the sheriffs had been called and they were going to come down to someone's house and maybe pawn their goods, you had to get the phone tree out. You had to call, 20 people on your street or on your estate, and then everyone had to go up there at sort of 7 o'clock in the morning and wait there all day long to have a massive protest outside in case the sheriffs did try and show up. So there's lots of examples in the book where people were, protesting, chasing the sheriffs away, sometimes, some pushing and shoving and so on. But, the battle line was literally on people's doorsteps to try and stop the poll tax from being implemented. In England and Wales, there was also a particularly fight around the courts. So people were taken to court, you were summoned. The councils would try and summons kind of 400 or 500 people in a day because so many people were not paying. And the anti-poll tax movement tried to encourage people to go to the court. Because if you went to the court, you could speak to the judge, you could challenge it, you could ask questions, you could try and get it delayed or anything like that. And the more people that did that, the more they couldn't deal with the other hundreds of people that hadn't shown up. So there was real delaying tactics of the courts. Anti-poll tax protesters would also go to the courts, sit in the gallery there, shout at the judges, throw things, people would pull fire alarms and, sort of get the whole courts evacuated. So there was a real sort of, strategy of tension and, trying to frustrate the legal proceedings as well. There's one really great example I've got in the book of one lawyer who was working on behalf of a council who spent the whole morning arguing with one particularly very difficult person that just wouldn't stop talking all the time. And then in the lunch break, the lawyer just disappeared and that was it. So, there was a real kind of pressure on the legal process to try and frustrate that. Of course, people will be aware of the poll tax riot in March 1990, a huge protest, 250,000 people. The police attacked it, a very violent action by the police there. And again, we have to see this in the context of the urban riots that happened in Tottenham and Liverpool and Bristol and Brixton in the early 1980s, the violence against the miners in the miners' strike, the Wapping dispute, which had just happened. So the police were really, they were tooled up, they were, and they turned up for a fight with people. And a fight is what happened. In the book, of course, I deal with some of the consequences of it. So this was the first central London riot, I think, since the Gordon riots in the 1780s. There have been riots in the kind of areas around central London, but I think this was the first proper riot in Trafalgar Square that had happened on any kind of like mass basis for, a good, like for a long while. The responses to it were very interesting and they really showed some of the political differences in the movement. So there was a spokesperson from Class War who was speaking on the news afterwards who said, kind of was praising the rioters and saying, this is great, this is, people fighting back, the police got what, they got what was coming to them and so on. And the ITV journalist was so shocked with all of this. He was like, well, he had to apologise to the viewers because the kind of things they were hearing were just so scandalous. It was like an outrage or whatever. But there was a real kind of sense that this was like a cathartic moment of just almost revenge, resistance against, the Thatcherite state and the police and all of the damage and pain that they'd inflicted over the last decade. Then there was then there was a response from groups like some of the militant spokespeople who, said that they were very upset with the rioting and they blamed the violence on the police, but they also thought that there was some anarchist troublemakers who'd infiltrated the demonstration and were causing trouble. There'd been maybe agent provocateurs or something like that. So there was two militant spokespeople at the time famously said, there'd be an investigation, they would name names to the police. They actually didn't do that, but you could see that there was kind of anger from militant because they'd organised this mass demonstration. They wanted it to be a kind of like a pretty standard Labour movement demonstration with banners and placards and a big rally at the end, which Tony Benn and Jeremy Corbyn and people like that were meant to be speaking at. And it was all disrupted by this massive fight with the police. And there was this kind of view that working class people might see the footage on the TV and be alienated by it. They might think that this was just, like a bunch of radicals or something like that. So there was lots of kind of very different responses to the riot. The mass movement of non-payment, 17 million people either didn't pay the tax or only paid it partially, and the poll tax collapsed. By late 1990, it had become untenable for Thatcher. She had to resign. The mass non-payment campaign just really sunk the flagship policy of her government, and kind of like it ended in disgrace. So that's kind of, it's obviously the very brief history of, the whole thing which I've gone through. There's loads of really great examples of resistance and kind of protest and so on. And just for the last couple of minutes, I'm just going to focus on some of the lessons I think that are useful today, which I summarize in the book. One is, in new struggles, you need new movements and new instruments. So, people that had just relied on the trade unions or the Labour Party, it wouldn't have worked. Like, those institutions were at that stage incapable of really fighting the poll tax. They were led by people who just were not interested in it or actually wanted to have it implemented. So what had to be built was new formations of struggle: the anti-poll tax unions, the anti-poll tax federations, the kind of local community networks and organisations which were created around that, some of which were minor support groups from the mid-80s that were kind of rejuvenated and brought back. So that kind of continuity of struggle and resistance, I think, is also quite important. The second thing is the difference between protest and resistance. So a protest movement is demonstrations, placards, petitions, protest marches. That's very important, don't get me wrong, but that's only one part of it. What really worked for the anti-poll tax movement was that it was a movement of resistance. This is a movement which actually sought to frustrate and defeat the poll tax from even being implemented. And that meant, there was fights outside the council chambers, there was rioting, people refused to pay. Lots of people went to prison for refusing to pay the poll tax, or they couldn't pay the poll tax. There was, clashes kind of, in and around kind of, like the legal system as well. And so the difference between just a protest movement and a movement of resistance, I think, is one that's quite interesting to think about. And the final thing is the crystallization of antagonism. So what I mean by that is that one of the things that really brought down Thatcher, it wasn't really just the riot or anything like that. It was that the mass movement was creating antagonisms within the political system. So a number of Tory MPs, there were by-elections for various reasons. I mean, some Tory MPs have been blown up by the IRA. Some of them, just kind of died in office or kind of like wanted to retire. And the Tories started losing or nearly losing all of the by-elections. That created a real crystallization of the antagonisms within the Tory backbench, because suddenly, if you're losing seats which previously had 20,000 voting majorities, no one's safe. And so the idea that the poll tax movement was threatening the stability of the political establishment for the Conservative Party, that was a huge part of Thatcher being brought down, because people in the end didn't think that she could sustain the course. They thought she was becoming an unpredictable and unreliable leader, and there was a mass movement of opposition to it.